So looking at the natural environment of Mesopotamia, we're also thinking about what impacts did the environment have on the way that Mesopotamian society, culture, and religion developed. The most important aspect of Mesopotamia were the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the land of Mesopotamia essentially just sort of stretched in between and on either side of these two rivers, sort of from their headwaters in the Zagros Mountains all the way down to where they emptied into the Persian Gulf region. And between these rivers, you have a lot of very flat land. A lot of times, this land was pretty barren. There were these sort of mud flats that were developed along them. And it was really along these mud flats, these very flat, open areas, with vegetation that would grow up sort of along the banks, but not like huge trees or forests or anything like that. And then when you get outside the range of the rivers, it actually becomes very arid and very hot and almost desert-like. So that's sort of the region that we're talking about here. These sort of mud flats near these very large rivers, and that's sort of the environment that that formed Mesopotamia. And one of the main defining features is that these rivers are sort of run through a very flat area, but they start up in the mountains. And in these mountains, you can have these really large thunderstorms. And these thunderstorms will then wash all this water from the mountains, pick up steam along the way, and sort of make these giant floods that flood out into these large plains. That's why you have this sort of large mud flat area which is developed around these rivers. And this leads to a couple different things. On the one hand, it brings some very fertile soil, which is one of the reasons why humans found it beneficial to try to build their cities and farm along these rivers, because there's some pretty nutrient-rich soil that's built up from these floods, and from the sediment that's sort of deposited along them. On the downside, these floods are very sporadic. They don't come more just like around one time of the year. We're going to make a comparison between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia and the Nile River in Egypt. And in Egypt, of course, the Nile River is going to flood much more regularly and much more predictably. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they can flood almost at any point in time, so much more difficult to try to figure out when those floods are coming. So even though it provides a lot of good nutrients in the soil and makes agriculture pretty productive there, it also has the potential to sort of, destroy cities and destroy homes and destroy fields, and can be pretty devastating. Another important defining feature is actually sort of the lack of features. It's the fact that really Mesopotamia is pretty wide open. Besides the rivers, there's not a lot of geography to break up the land or the landscape. And this meant that essentially the towns and cities and villages that were developed along there were sort of out in the open. There was nothing sort of protecting them from other people coming from outside of Mesopotamia, whether they were conquerors or raiders or anyone else who just wanted to come into the area. Pretty easy for that to happen and occur, and there wasn't a whole lot of strategic natural advantages that they could gain against one another. Essentially, what you see developing are these sort of city-states, where cities and the hinterlands around them were sort of competing against one another, until eventually you start having the development of larger kingdoms and empires and so forth. But in the beginning, it's essentially just a lot of small towns sort of competing against each other, and really not a lot of strategic advantage, at least in the landscape. Very wide open, which also I think led to sort of a sense of vulnerability for the people who lived there. But despite these challenges, the flooding and the sort of open nature of the landscape, you see the development of some of the largest, earliest large cities in the world in Mesopotamia, and this is in spite of, and perhaps because of, these challenges. The fact that perhaps because these challenges were there, it sort of required more people working together to try to solve these problems. So you have the development of these larger cities and larger governmental systems and so forth to try to overcome these challenges. But this environment is going to be impacting Mesopotamia in a lot of different ways. On the one hand, pretty much everything that they're going to make and create is going to be having to do in some way with what they have an abundance of, and that's mud. For example, their buildings are built out of mud brick. Irrigation is cut out of the mud of the rivers, and they actually create a very advanced sort of irrigation system to try to make it so that they can plant their fields a ways away from the river, so they're not just right on the banks and getting constantly flooded, and try to direct the water down into them. So you have some pretty advanced knowledge being created on how to irrigate fields. This is one of the first locations, of course, that writing is developed. And not surprisingly, when they start writing, they write on baked mud brick, because of course that's what they have a lot of, written on with a reed, which is something else, muds and reeds is something they have a whole lot of, and that's what eventually what they use to create their writing system. And also, just like I said, the development of war and combat between a lot of these various cities and sort of rivalries was also something that I think the sort of wide open nature of the geography probably encouraged. So one result that you see of this is really the creation of sort of a pessimistic society. It seemed like the Mesopotamians always sort of looked at the glass half empty. They were always sort of waiting for the other shoe to fall and for something to go wrong. And this, I think, really, once more, comes from that sense of vulnerability, that they don't know when the rivers are going to flood, they don't know when another army is going to come and try to invade their towns or their cities. They don't know if they're going to be getting a new king the next time a new king takes over. If maybe they like their current king, but who knows? Their offspring or the next in line might not be very good. And it really seemed that most of the Mesopotamians felt that they were very much at the whims of fate. This viewed how they sort of came to recognize their gods, right? Their pantheon that they believed in. Because for the most part, while the gods were sort of shared a lot of human characteristics, they seemed very human in nature as far as they were very strong and powerful, but they had a lot of the same human concerns and rivalries and jealousies. But for the most part, they weren't terribly kind to humans and to people. It seemed like the Mesopotamian gods didn't really care about humans, and at most sort of looked at them as an annoyance. A few of them certainly did help out. For example, you have the goddess Inanna, who was famously sort of stole all the technology of civilization from the gods and brought it down to the people. But you also have gods who try to essentially destroy and wipe out all of humanity for essentially because they got mad that humans were making too much noise. That's one of the reasons that is given in some of the accounts of the flood epic, which we're going to be talking about more next week. So you sort of have this juxtaposition where the gods are very sort of fickle and finicky, and certainly in a lot of cases don't seem to have humans' best interests in mind. Another great example of this is their view of the afterlife, right? That idea that the afterlife, whether you were good or bad during your life, didn't really matter. That everyone went to some place that was relatively unpleasant, this sort of very deserty, cave-like area where people would sort of eat dirt and dust because there was nothing to eat, and they're constantly hungry, and there was no light, and just sounded sort of like a very dirty, dreadful place. But I think it sort of tells or taps into the mentality of the Mesopotamians that while they sort of felt like their lives were precarious, and while they felt like there wasn't necessarily something good waiting for them, that they wanted to try to make the most of the time that they had. And I think you really see that reflected in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The conclusion, of course, that Gilgamesh arrives at the end of his epic, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this coming up as well, is that the purpose of life is to try to sort of live as fulfilled of a life as you can, that humans aren't immortal, we are all going to die. So you should try to live the best life that you can with the time that's given you. And it seems like that's something that the Mesopotamians certainly did take to heart. And even though there was this pessimistic outlook, they accomplished great things. They created some of the very largest early cities. They created some of the first empires. They created, monumental construction and building, some of the first examples of writing, of creative writing. And a lot of their sort of religion and religious ideas are going to be also very much felt through the ages. Developments and advancements in astronomy and mathematics. All of those were completed despite these challenges, which I think is pretty admirable in a lot of ways. So read the reverberation section on page 20, then answer the following question. Why do scholars believe urbanization contributed to the development of patriarchy? And real quick at the beginning of this, I just want to remind everyone that if you ever have instructions that tell you to read a particular section or page or watch a specific video and then answer questions, please make sure that you actually do read that before answering the questions. There are some people who seem to just sort of want to take the prior knowledge that they had to try to answer this question without actually reading the section first, which means you're going to be losing points because you're supposed to be answering specifically based upon the information presented in that section. So that being said, what are some of the things that scholars, or some of the reasons that scholars believe urbanization contributed to the development of patriarchy? The big commonality is really the transition to the importance of agriculture. And really this kind of goes back to some of the things we talked about last week in the transition between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic and the impact that that's going to have on the creation of social stratification, right? That there's now different levels within society, people doing different things and so forth. And increasingly what you see is that because sedentary lifestyles and agriculture allowed people to have more children and for women to be pregnant more often and have a higher success and chance of birth, which are all things that generally people in populations liked, that ended up meaning that women were going to be pregnant or caring for small children for a much longer period of time than they would have been in hunting and gathering societies. And that means that they're going to be out in the fields working less of the time than they would have been in a hunting-gathering society. So you start seeing that sort of general parity between the amount of food and intake, caloric intake, being provided by both genders in a hunting and gathering society. And it starts becoming tipped more and more towards men producing more of the food, while women are sort of expected to produce people who are going to go out and work in the fields and aren't contributing as much. Certainly women are still going to be contributing to agriculture a lot, right? Even though they might be taking care of children, they're still going to be taking care of animals. They're still going to be doing some planting potentially and other sort of agricultural work, and just everything you need to do to run a household is very, very labor intensive. So even though they might not be going off away from the house as much potentially as men might be, they're still working an incredible amount through this time period. But the fact that they are tied more to sort of one set domestic location is going to have an impact. It has a similar impact on war and warfare. Where it seems like in hunter and gatherer societies and in the nomadic societies that we talked about this week, there's a higher tendency of both men and women to participate in combat, to be warriors, to have training in that aspect. And similarly, because once more women are going to be tied once more to sort of this one domestic location, that it's going to be harder for them to be soldiers and warriors and well. And as time goes on, it seems that that's another area where they start being phased out. So you start seeing for the first time a much more distinct separation between sort of two different spheres. The public sphere, where people are sort of operating outside the house and the household, whether it's politics or whether it's working in large-scale agriculture, whether it's working in various craft industries, whether it's eventually sort of politics and so forth. And the domestic sphere, which is sort of the home, the household, and so forth. And you start seeing men and women being assigned different gender roles based upon those two spheres, where men more and more are going to be expected to engage with the public sphere, and women are going to be expected to engage more solely with the domestic sphere, where that prior to the development of agriculture was not necessarily the case, and that's only intensified in urbanization, right? When cities and towns start getting propped up, you see it becoming codified in laws. For example, inheritance laws. Who can inherit what? Can women actually inherit property and be property owners? Can they not? These are all things that are going to make a huge difference. And as time goes on, the public sphere and the domestic sphere are going to get farther and farther apart, and particularly through this process of urbanization. Also, that fact that one of the biggest contributors to stratification was that idea of wealth and property, right? The fact that people sort of have this wealth that they can pass on from one generation to another, and this is going to get tied up with the development of kingship too, where people want to sort of track their lineages from one generation to the next. And as a part of that, there starts being closer and closer restrictions put on women to make sure that people can sort of protect those bloodlines, so they know sort of where their heirs are coming from. There have been plenty of societies in the past that have gotten around this by just making their societies matrilineal, meaning that instead of trying to trace descendancy through the male line, which is much more sort of tricky to try to trace, they trace it through the female line, because that's much simpler, because while there can always be potentially questions about who might be the father of a child, it's very hard to debate who the mother is, particularly if you have anyone around when a child is born. You can very clearly say this child belongs to this mother. Increasingly, though, a lot of these patriarchal societies try to become patrilineal and try to trace descendancy and heritage only through the male line. And in order to try to do that, they want to try to make sure that women are going to be sequestered and controlled as much as possible, to make sure that someone else doesn't come in and potentially have a claim to their titles, their property, and so forth. You start seeing a lot more restrictions put on women that had never been placed on them prior to this move into urbanization. And as time goes on, these things are going to become entrenched within society in a lot of ways. One of them I already mentioned was sort of through the legal process, and once these civilizations and cities and towns start creating standardized legal structures, you start seeing that patriarchy reflected in there, which makes it even sort of harder to fight against once it becomes put into laws. Another very important role that starts playing is in religion, as increasingly religion starts being part of that public sphere, where men are fulfilling important religious obligations and roles, and women are increasingly being left out of that. Sort of the traditional religion of the hunter-gatherer societies, sort of that ancestor worship and so forth, seemed very egalitarian as far as we know, where both males and females were both allowed to worship and participate in the sort of religious rituals and so forth, and would both be honored and revered after death. With the transition to religions during this time period, and we sort of talked about this with the Mesopotamian gods already, that religion is changing as society is changing. Religion is, in a lot of ways, mirroring society. So because society is turning into a much more hierarchical, stratified system with kings and a aristocracy and so forth, you start seeing religion becoming more hierarchical as well, with increasingly religious positions being reserved for men and males, and women sort of being kept out of it. And that, once more, is going to make it even harder as time goes on, in order to participate in anything outside of that domestic sphere, which is going to constantly be eroding women's access to prestige and power and resources as time goes on. It's important to note that at this point in time, this process is not complete. There's a lot of these early religions that I'm going to sort of refer to as the creation of these anthropomorphic nature gods, gods that resemble human societies, but also a lot of times have natural elements, particularly because of how important natural environments are, right? So, for example, some of the most important gods of the Mesopotamians are the god of fresh water, the god of the sky and thunderstorms, as well as the goddess, oftentimes goddess of fertility, is very important in these anthropomorphic nature god pantheons. This is going to be similar whether you're talking about the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, eventually the Greeks. But another transition is going to occur when we start talking about what we're going to be calling axial age religions, and we'll be talking more about those in a few weeks here, because at this point in time, while women are starting to get sort of pushed out of their roles in religious participation, it's going to become much more codified and much more entrenched when there's this transition to these axial age religions, because there were still in a lot of these societies important places for women to play in religion as priestesses and so forth, that eventually is going to be essentially taken away from them as people start converting to the sort of new wave of religions that is going to be coming along beginning around the year 1000 BCE, and continuing from there. So those are a lot of the reasons why you see sort of urbanization contributing to this development of patriarchy. Review the Epic of Gilgamesh. What elements of this story do you still see in modern storytelling? Why do you think themes which were developed over 3,000 years ago still have relevance today? I thought everyone did a fantastic job on this question. A lot of you did a really good job pointing out that the Epic of Gilgamesh, like a lot of stories today, have a lot of really similar elements. Essentially, it's the hero's journey, right? That Gilgamesh has to go and have all these sort of trials and learn various lessons and face lots of challenges. He makes mistakes, he learns from them, and at the end of the day, he learns a lesson. There are character arcs, and also just sort of a lot of people pointed out very correctly this is sort of the first comic book story that Gilgamesh is kind of like a superhero, like a Thor or Superman or any sort of superhero you can think of. This is kind of the first superhero story, if you want to think of it in those terms. And it brings up a lot of issues that seem very, very familiar to us. Issues of mortality, of friendship, heroism, nature versus civilization, hubris. These are all issues that are tackled in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So why does this story that was written so long ago still seem so relevant and still have so many aspects of it that we can identify with? To a certain degree, I think just people are people. People who wrote and created this story and created the myth of Gilgamesh had all these various issues on their mind, just like people today still have. So the people who are writing comic books or making comic book movies are thinking of those same sort of issues in the same kind of way that the people who created these stories were creating, 3,000 years ago. Also, the people then and now actually still live relatively similar lives. We are still essentially in a large agricultural state, meaning that we are survived and live off of agriculture. And that a lot of the things that we care about and the issues we're concerned about are relatively similar between their time and our time now. That people sort of want safety and security in their life. They care about their friends and their family. And it's fun to think about, hey, what if someone did have super strength? What if they were divine or had the power of the gods? What would they do? How would they act? And certainly, I think the Epic of Gilgamesh sort of offers all of that for people, which is why it is still so resonant today as it was when it was created. So describe some of the traditions and life ways of those discussed this week who lived outside of the large sedentary agricultural states that we've been focusing on these past few weeks. Why might these cultures have chosen not to organize themselves into sedentary states? So primarily this week we discussed nomads as sort of the alternative to sedentary states. And it's important to note off the bat that nomads are not hunter and gatherers. There seemed to be some confusion as far as that in some of your answers. The biggest differential is that nomads, of course, still use agriculture, primarily the domestication of animals. So they weren't simply roaming around looking for animals to hunt, rather they were herding large groups of sheep or goats, quite typically. Yaks, other sort of large land animals that could be domesticated and kept in herds to supply humans with what they need to survive. So even though they weren't really planting crops in that sense, they certainly were still using agriculture in domestication and herding. And of course, perhaps the most important animal that is domesticated and which becomes vital to all of these nomadic cultures is the horse. The horse becomes essential because it allows them to more easily keep track of their various herds, to travel over the large and long distances that make up the areas that the nomads typically inhabit, which are oftentimes sort of larger, more arid locations that are not well suited for agriculture. And also because they are sort of constantly moving, that's going to be an important element in transportation. The main reason why these nomadic groups are constantly moving is because of the animals they are herding. If you're talking about sheep or goats or things of that nature, they're very intensive on the environment that they are in. So if they keep them in one location for too long, they're just going to eat up all the grass. The grass isn't going to be able to grow, and soon the location you're at is no good for anyone. So the key is to continually move these herds from one location to another location. Oftentimes, depending upon what season is, you might go from the highlands to the lowlands, where the majority of the grass is going to be available. And from there, allow the animals to continue to feed and grow, as opposed to sedentary life, which would not work with the animals in as large quantities as the nomads had to have in order to survive. So all this is going to lead to a number of lifeways. You certainly see a reliance on meat and dairy and hides to survive. That the herds are going to provide the people most of what they're going to need. There might still be some gathering that occurs throughout their travel to sort of supplement this, but the majority of what they're going to need is going to be their herds, their horses, and what they can sort of easily carry with them, because they are always going to be on the move. Certainly just that very non-sedentary nature is going to be another sort of key factor. Oftentimes, these nomads are going to be very territorial. There was a sense that for somehow the nomads were more peaceful than sedentary agriculturalists, and I do not believe that is the case. There was just as much infighting between nomadic groups as there were between sedentary agricultural groups. They all had their own access to water. They all had their own sort of territories that they would pretty regularly bring their herds to in sort of a migratory pattern. And if someone started encroaching on that, there oftentimes were conflicts, not to mention the fact that oftentimes there are conflicts between these large nomadic groups and the surrounding more sedentary agricultural people and states. So certainly I wouldn't say it was necessarily any more peaceful than living in a sedentary agricultural state. But because I would say, or partially because of this, you do see the formation of large clans that are bound together. So even though they're spaced out by a long distance, they are trying to keep harmony and peace with one another through these various family ties and family bonds, which actually leads to the creation of some very large cultural groups, which certainly I think could be considered civilizations in their own right. They might be dispersed and widespread, but it was very common for them to get together for feasts and festivals and celebrations, as well as getting together to try to engage in warfare. So even though sort of per capita they might not have as high as the population as a densely populated agricultural area, because they're in the steppeland region or other regions that are oftentimes much larger in size than those agricultural areas, you can have very large population levels being developed and sustained based on this nomadic lifestyle. This is also going to give them a very powerful military for a couple of reasons. The first aspect is the horse. The horse was essentially the sort of biggest X factor in military power. If you could successfully use cavalry in any way, in any form of warfare before the industrial age, you would have a major advantage. And because nomads essentially spent their entire lives on horses, meant that they were very good horse warriors, warriors on horseback, which oftentimes gave them a real advantage against sedentary agricultural states. The agricultural states might have horses and might have cavalry as well, but oftentimes they weren't as used to fighting on horseback. They weren't as well trained, or even if they were, they weren't in large enough numbers to combat. Essentially, all the warriors from the nomadic peoples were on horseback. And they also developed military tactics specifically for fighting on horseback, which oftentimes drove sedentary agricultural peoples crazy. And I'll be discussing more about that in a moment here. So why then might these cultures have chosen not to organize themselves into sedentary states? To a certain degree, the nomads made the exact same choice that sedentary agriculturalists made. They needed to find a way to sustain higher population levels. And the big difference is the nomadic peoples oftentimes were simply in geographic areas where you couldn't grow lots of crops. It was too dry, the soil was not conducive, there weren't a lot of rivers or fresh water sources, so you can't grow enough food to support large populations. So they realized, well, as opposed to that, we can domesticate animals and use that to increase our population level. Essentially, they were making really smart decisions for what made sense given their environment, which is one thing, like I mentioned last week, that humans oftentimes do. So in that sense, they were making kind of the same choice as sedentary agriculturalists, just figuring out what was going to work best for their context. There's also plenty of examples of people escaping or choosing to leave stratified agricultural states and become nomads or hunter-gatherers to try to avoid the social stratification, try to avoid becoming enslaved, or if you were an enslaved person or population, trying to escape and get away from that. And oftentimes you do see less social stratification in these nomadic groups than you do see in the large agricultural sedentary states. And I think an interesting way to think of this is that these also are not always all of one thing or all the other if you're talking about sedentary or nomads, because a lot of times, there might be a situation where a people's agricultural endeavors do not work out. Maybe the climate changes, they're no longer able to sustain themselves with crops, but they still have their animals, and you do see examples of sedentary agricultural people converting to nomads. Also, you do see lots of examples of nomads through war and combat taking over large sedentary agricultural states. And it's really interesting to see what happens after that occurs. Essentially, once nomads take over a large sedentary agricultural states, almost always they will themselves adopt that lifestyle. They will adopt becoming a sedentary agricultural life and give up their nomadism. You might still see lots of cultural hangovers from the time that they were nomads. A lot of times they might still have a really strong horse, cavalry, military. A lot of their customs and beliefs might still come from the time period that they were nomads, but primarily they are no longer engaging in no nomadic way of life to survive, because oftentimes, just like trying to grow a lot of plants in the barren steppeland arid region doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense to try to have large herds of animals roving around areas that are well suited for agriculture, because you're going to be running into forests and rivers and a lot more sort of geographic impediments, which are not good for large herds. You're going to be running into a lot of people also trying to grow their own agricultural crops, which is going to create conflicts and generally not be good for anyone. So it's interesting to see that typically one way or another in the locations that make sense for sedentary agriculture and primarily growing and harvesting crops and plants, no matter where you started out, when people get into those regions, they adopt that kind of lifestyle. And the same thing happens the other way. When people get into arid, dry, barren areas that are not well suited for growing plants, but is well suited for growing and utilizing domesticated animals, they will choose that option to increase their population and keep that larger population level. If you're in an area where it's not well suited for either herding or planting, quite typically that's when you have people just being back to that hunting and gathering lifestyle, which makes sense for that context. So what do you see as some of the advantages that nomadic peoples had over sedentary agriculturalists, and what advantages did sedentary agricultural peoples have over nomads? So looking at the nomads, really I would say one advantage that they had is that their lifestyle and lifeways were more fluid. That they did have that opportunity if there was going to be a natural disaster or a drought in a particular region, that they could be easily moved or relocated, and that they weren't necessarily tied to one set location, which could certainly be an advantage. As a lot of you pointed out in your answers, there was a lot less social stratification in nomadic groups. There was more equality between men and women oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes. There was less examples of slavery. Once more, not that it didn't exist. There was certainly slavery among nomadic peoples as well, but it certainly usually was not as systemic as what you see developing in these large agricultural states and empires. Oftentimes, nomads actually had a stronger military. There seemed like some people thought that sedentary agriculturalists would have a stronger military. That actually wasn't the case. In most of the military engagements between nomadic peoples and sedentary agricultural peoples, the nomads are usually going to have the advantage. I talked in the last answer about one of the reasons why this was the very close relationship between horses that the nomadic peoples had. And that's going to be very important for a couple of reasons. First of all, one of the main military technologies that they developed is something that's become known as the Parthian shot. And essentially, it's a maneuver that pretty much all the nomads develop at one point in time or another, where they sort of charge on their horses at a line of usually non-mounted soldiers, and before they get within range of the archers of their opponents, they'll wheel their horses around, they'll lean over the saddle looking sort of backwards, and they'll fire off a shot that will still get to the land forces of their opponents. And before they can be retaliated against, they'll just ride away. And they can just do this in wave after wave after wave until eventually the sort of standing soldiers of whoever they are fighting get diminished, get exhausted, get tired, and then they can come in with their swords and whatnot and sort of mop up. If for whatever reason things go wrong in a military engagement, this is another advantage that the nomads have, is that they can essentially just leave. Whereas sedentary agriculturalists, there are things that they need to be defending. They need to be defending a city. They need to be defending their fields. There's a set point that they can't retreat any farther. And even if they do hold up within their city, they're essentially then sacrificing all the hinterland region and their availability to get foods. Whereas nomads, their herds are oftentimes well away from any sort of military engagement. They can't be touched by their enemies. And if, like I said, things go wrong, they can simply retreat, regroup, and try to engage in more favorable terms, which a lot of times sedentary agriculturalists didn't have that option. So a lot of times the military tactics are going to be in their favor. There also seemed to be a misconception that sedentary agriculturalists were primarily the people who were trading. And certainly they were trading, and they were oftentimes the people who were originating the trade goods. But the nomads a lot of times were sort of the people who actually were the traders, going from point A to point B. The Silk Road, which we're going to be talking about coming up here, becomes the largest sort of trade route between China and the Middle East, the biggest land trade route of Eurasia and really of the world. And for the most part, the people who are doing the trading along that, while it might be originating in agricultural areas like China and ending up in the Persian Empire or somewhere like that, along the way, most of the time it's going to be nomads either doing the trading or a lot of times raiding those trade routes and accumulating wealth and goods in that way. So they were very, very involved in trade as well, and I wouldn't necessarily make that an advantage to one side or the other. Another aspect that the nomads sort of had going for them is a lot of times they were healthier than people who lived in these large sedentary agricultural states. A lot of times overcrowding cities were sort of notoriously crowded and unsanitary, and nomads actually lived a much healthier lifestyle than sedentary agriculturalists, which I say would be another advantage of them. So, what advantage did sedentary agriculturalists have? Well, certainly the biggest that a lot of people point out was that sedentary lifestyle. They didn't have to constantly be moving from point A to point B in order to try to supply themselves and sustain themselves. A little bit easier, oftentimes, on women to give birth. So you do start having some higher birth rates in sedentary agricultural states than you do have in nomad populations. Also, the entire ability to accumulate surplus and wealth is much easier for sedentary agricultural states. So they oftentimes would have more material wealth. They'd have more food reserves than nomads who would have to be moving much more often would be able to accumulate. And also just the development of technology was much more common in sedentary agricultural states. Now, sedentary agriculturalists a lot of times like to sort of use this as a way, and people who are still living in sedentary agricultural states like to say, well, this is something that we really like about sedentary agricultural states because it's people who live lives similar to us doing things that we sort of like. So whether it's the development of writing or the development of complex sort of religious systems or any other number of technology you want to try to point out, primarily those are going to be developed and created in these sedentary agricultural states. And one of the reasons for that is that there's just a lot more variety in the life and the lifestyle in the sedentary agricultural states. You have more people who do not have to be sort of engaged in agricultural practices. You have more people involved in sort of running and bureaucracy of these cities. Everything that's sort of stemmed from bureaucracy is another sort of element that is adopted into these states that really, the reason that the nomads don't adopt and create a lot of these is that they just simply don't have a use or a need for them. If pretty much you're able to accomplish everything you need with a very sort of simplistic lifestyle, there's no reason to try to innovate and create something new or different. For example, if you want to think about writing, if you're in a large agricultural state where there are these complex bureaucracies, oftentimes the only reason writing is created is to count beans, essentially, to figure out who created what or who produced what, who paid their taxes. A lot of times the development of writing is very much tied to the creation of taxation, who is sort of given their share. And if you don't sort of have that initial need for that sort of complex record keeping, there's really no point in developing all the time and energy to develop a whole written system when you can just ride up to someone on a horse and talk to them. That's really a lot more effective and efficient, which oftentimes was more than enough for the nomadic people to get what they needed. Whereas sedentary agriculturalists oftentimes needed much more complex systems to make sense of a much wider variety of people and occupations and life ways going on. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages that you might want to talk about. But as always, these are very complex. None of them usually are absolute, and you can see examples of these sort of benefits on both sides. This is really just speaking in generalities. All right, just a few reminders before we move on to our primary source discussion here. First of all, make sure that you are having the word length requirements for your answers. Remember, for each question, your answer needs to be 100 words in length, and for each of your response to another student's question, that needs to be 50 words in length. A lot of you were missing a few points this week because your answers just simply weren't long enough. So if you're going to be writing 2 sentences to another student, go ahead and just write a couple more. Find another point that you thought was interesting that you want to comment on. Maybe tell them something that you wrote that you didn't see in their answers that you think might be important. Just find ways to expand a little bit, and you'll be getting those points. Also, make sure that you are bringing in specific examples from the documents into your answers. Make sure that you are you're bringing specific examples from the documents into your answers. That you're not just giving a broad overview to answer the question. They're saying specifically the document says this. Using quotes is a great way to do this. Your answer shouldn't be all quotes, but I'd say that in your answers, you should probably have at least one per answer to help back up what you're saying, because that's really going to help your grade towards understanding that I know what you're trying to say and communicate, because you essentially make a point and then you're backing it up with something. You're saying, this is where I'm seeing this in the document. And that's going to be the easiest way for you to get full points on these activities. Make sure the word length is there. Make sure those specific examples are being used as well. All right, so moving on to the document itself. So based on these two documents, list some of the responsibilities and expectations of Mesopotamian kings. I thought the class overall did a pretty good job on this. Once more, I liked people who are able to not just sort of generalize that, yeah, they're supposed to sort of look out for their people, but get more in depth of your answers. For example, they're supposed to be leading their soldiers into warfare. There's that great example of Gilgamesh. He's leading from the front, but he's also going to the rear to make sure no one's left behind. What a great sort of idea of what a leader is supposed to be. Building walls, digging wells, clearing passes, passing laws. Of course, Hammurabi's is very much tied to his sort of laws that he's going to be passing. So being a lawgiver, planting crops, helping locations recover from natural disasters, primarily flooding, right? We talked about how prevalent the flooding was. So it's interesting that the documents are actually talking about these leaders being expected to help their people and communities recover when these disasters hit. Another big element of both of these documents was religious obligations. The fact that they were supposed to be building temples, that they were supposed to be making sacrifices to the gods, that they were supposed to be fulfilling these sort of religious roles that was very early sort of entered into what was supposed to make a responsibility of a king. So those are all some things that that people brought up and mentioned from the documents that I thought were great examples of sort of what was expected of a Mesopotamian king. So what were some of the differences that you saw between the portrayal of Gilgamesh and the portrayal of Hammurabi? Well, a lot of Gilgamesh's document really seemed to be pointing out the importance of his physical features, right? How high he was, how tall he was, the fact that he was 2/3 god. And a lot of you pointed out that most of what was talked about in Gilgamesh's document were his personal achievements, the things that he did, the kind of leader he was, that he built the walls of Uruk, seemingly single-handedly. That these were all sort of he was such a great sort of leader because of what he himself did. Looking at Hammurabi, sort of different. He was perceived as being sort of more God-fearing, that he was sort of, doing his obligations that the gods had sort of given upon him, so sort of fulfilling his duty. That really sort of, a lot of his achievements were based on sort of good government, that he was supposed to care for the oppressed, that he was supposed to construct monuments, that he was supposed to provide flood relief. If you want to think of it, a lot of Hammurabi's document was based around sort of public achievements, the things that sort of the position of a king is supposed to do, not necessarily that Hammurabi was out doing all these things himself. So a sort of a different, interesting way that both of these leaders are being portrayed here. Just on a note, for question number 2, I know some people brought in sort of knowledge and ideas from the other class materials about Gilgamesh, which is fine. I'm very glad that you're bringing that in, but remember, you're still supposed to be looking at and answering this question based off specifically what the document is talking about. So some people were bringing up sort of a lot of the flaws that Gilgamesh has as a character in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is very true, but those aren't being portrayed in this particular document. So remember, I want you to be answering these questions based on the document itself. And if you want to bring in outside information to help you answer it, that's fantastic. That's great. That'll get you full points, really. You should be doing that to some degree. But that outside information shouldn't be overriding what you're reading in the document. And if you see a conflict saying, hey, this document seems to somehow not be jiving with what else we learned this week, go ahead and point it out. Because certainly history isn't clear-cut. There isn't just one answer. And someone like Gilgamesh is a complicated figure, right? That he does sort of go through this character arc where he is a very, very bad guy at the beginning of his reign, and by the end of his story, he's much more perceived as a sympathetic figure. And since the preface of sort of the epic, which is what our document comes from, is sort of looking at the tale as a whole. It sort of takes into that account and is very much talking about Gilgamesh more towards at the end of his journey, where he is sort of perceived more as a sympathetic character after he sort of learned his lessons of the sort of atrocious things he had done early in his reign as king. And certainly, some documents also are different. There are various stories of Gilgamesh, and they aren't all the same. Essentially, the epic that we think of today is compiled from a number of different tellings that were created about this sort of mythological figure. So, just a few more things to keep in mind. So looking at number 3, based on what we have learned, why do you believe kingship became so common and widespread? And do the documents provide any evidence for how and why kingship was developed? And if you remember back to the PowerPoint, we sort of discussed this transition that seemed to happen in these early cities, where very early on you see most of the time religious leaders or kind of a city council almost running these cities. But as time goes on, they are transitioning to the position of kings and kingship. It seems particularly in Mesopotamia that warfare really drove this, that in a time of war they'd sort of appoint one person to be sort of a temporary king to make these important military decisions and to lead troops into battle. And as warfare became more and more common between these cities, these kings were elected for a longer and longer period of time until eventually they just sort of found ways to make their positions permanent and were able to essentially take the power that had been held by temple leaders or had been held by city leaders and say, nope, now all that power is within myself, is within this position of the king. And it seems like once that was adopted, they were able to get oftentimes a lot of the aristocracy and military to go along with them. I mean, a lot of times soldiers figured, well, we like this guy, he's doing good things for us, so we should keep backing him up, even if it doesn't necessarily go with the precedents that had already been set. And a lot of people realize, well, if I support this king in his endeavor to take power, I'm going to get some sort of reward from it, so I should probably keep on backing him and supporting him. So after a few generations, you start seeing a lot of people who are typically able to avoid having to do a lot of agricultural work themselves. They are now being supported by a separate class of farmers, and sometimes, in certain cases, enslaved individuals who are doing the labor of producing the food while they are able to do other things, whether it's fight or be part of the religious establishment or be part of a nobility. And all of that is backed up oftentimes by supporting this sort of kingship model. So those are some of the reasons why I think it becomes sort of so widespread. And of course, kingship has a lot of pros and cons. On the one hand, if you have a king or a leader, who has the support of the population, who has the population's best interest in mind, who's of sane mind and is competent, you can get a lot done really quickly. Of course, the con is if you take any of those away, if you have a population that isn't going along with a particular king, if you have a king who isn't necessarily a great leader or doesn't make the best decisions, you can get into trouble really, really quickly as well. But once kingship is adopted, it seems pretty hard to remove, as so many people with who essentially have the power within a civilization, they have the money, they have the wealth, they have the weapons, tend to place their support behind this sort of kingship model because I think it's sort of a stable way for them to maintain that level of wealth and status. Oftentimes, then, this is also going to be codified into religion. Just like patriarchy in our previous question gets codified into religion, so too here does kingship, as oftentimes the gods start modeling a similar model where there's a king of the gods, oftentimes in these sort of anthropomorphic nature god populations, or the gods are seen, or the kings are seen as somehow having support of the god, or they're supposed to be filling religious obligations as well as secular obligations and are sort of religious figures in their own right. All of these are going to be ways to sort of help make the position of a king more important and more permanent within a society. And once it's there, it's going to be very, very hard to remove or question, and that's probably one of the reasons why it does become adopted so widely across the world. And once it is adopted, it's just really hard to get rid of until you have usually some sort of revolution, which isn't going to be taking place in most locations for quite some time. There's going to be various takes on the version of kingship, whether it's an imperial system or whether it's an oligarchy or something like that. But typically, it's going to be not universal, but fairly common in these large agricultural sedentary states. Of course, nomadic people, which we've been talking about this week, they have different ways. They're not always under a kingship model, oftentimes because they do have less social stratification. They have more of a sort of tribal system where there's more of sort of a sometimes a council, sometimes there is a group of elders, various ways of distributing power. And of course, we're going to be talking about in a few weeks the Greeks too, who also come up with a alternative model. Some of the Greeks, not all of the Greeks, some of the Greeks come up with an alternate model to this sort of kingship-based system. All right, moving on to question number 4. So, do Hammurabi and Gilgamesh show any similarities to modern-day rulers? In a general sense, a lot of people said, that it's just sort of those basic tenets of trying to support your people, help them recover from natural disasters, infrastructure projects, religious obligations sometimes, that those were all similar in certain senses to what we could identify. Some people identified specific rulers. I heard Gilgamesh being compared to Donald Trump, to Vladimir Putin, to Kim Jong-un. I heard Hammurabi being compared to Obama or Justin Trudeau. So some people took a much more sort of direct parallel between these historic figures and modern figures, while some people said, no, I don't see kind of a real direct parallel between any modern people, but in general, some of the requirements and responsibilities they have might be similar.